Good morning and welcome to the first day of AusCERT2022. My name is Valdemar Jacobson from Business Aspect and I'm your chair for this session. Right now we have Chris and I'm having a complete mental blank. Steve. Complete mental blank from Ground Labs, talking about upcoming changes to the Australian Privacy Act and how that might impact business in Australia. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. So thanks for joining us here in this session. We're obviously here to talk about data security. There's a number of changes going on out there in the regulatory world within government on multiple fronts. And given that this is AusCERT and Chris and I hail from a very technical slanted background, and the sessions here going on about incident response and various other technical topics, we wanted to really focus in on what it would mean to security professionals based on a few interesting things that Chris and I can see coming down the line and what we think that's going to change in terms of our mindset, where we need to focus. And we'll take a look at Australia. We'll go a little bit beyond Australia and then bring it back to some initiatives that are happening right now. But before I get into that, maybe we'll quickly introduce ourselves, starting with this gentleman to my right.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Chris Allen. I'm the Director for Advisory Assurance and Compliance at Securo. And so I spend my time helping organisations to prepare for their compliance obligations. So I run the GRC team at Securo and also the technical assurance understanding, so the penetration testing and red teams all work with me to help secure organisations across Australia and Singapore.
And these days a proud Queenslander too.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am.
And I'm Steve Cavey. I'm Australian by background, but I've lived in Singapore for the last 10 years. I'm the co-founder of Ground Labs. We help organisations around the world. I've had a lot of exposure to all sorts of organisations, and Chris and I have spent a lot of time together out there working with clients to help them understand their data security posture and help them understand the types of data that they're storing. And we've seen a lot of war stories together, and certainly things we probably can't talk about in detail, but we've learned a lot as well through the process of having worked together in different organisations and some of the other things that I've seen around the world. And so I guess to kick the discussion off, Chris, you've done a lot of security assessments over time. You've worked with government organisations, private organisations, large and small. You've been involved in incident response. You often get called into an organisation to help them either improve their security posture or be assessed to some kind of a standard or achieve some sort of compliance. Why, in your view, are you typically being called in? What's the motivator and the driver as to why they're seeking your help?
Yeah, well, I think we posed the question early on in our preparation as well. Is the Privacy Act that we've got here in Australia driving that? And I think the reality is, although we do have lots of conversations with colleagues about the Privacy Act, it's not really the motivator for a lot of the conversation. So you would then say, well, if the Privacy Act is not the legislation that people are making their decisions on, then why are we talking to them? Well, it still is legislation driven predominantly. It's compliance driven. They are required to be CPS 234 aligned. They're required to be following PCI DSS, and that's driven by their merchant banks. They predominantly are now needing to align to ISO 27001, whether directly because it's a contractual requirement or more specifically for a lot of clients at the moment around RFFR. So I think the picture that I'm trying to present is that many of our clients start their conversations with Securo around compliance. They're very familiar with the need for penetration testing, and we have lots of conversations around that. But predominantly the start of the conversation is, I need to comply with this thing. So
you mentioned obviously a key topic we wanted to touch on here, which is the Australian Privacy Act of 1988. And when it comes,
years old.
Yeah, it's 34 years old. It's a regulation that's been updated a lot over time, and there's been a couple of really notable changes in the last several years. One's around something. Who here's heard of the Australian privacy principles? Good. And who's familiar with the notifiable data breach scheme? Fantastic. So we're off to a good start, I think, based on the audience here. So what we find is that there's been a lot of changes to the Australian Privacy Act, But probably I want more. So I want your view more so on this than mine. Are you being asked about it still, given all these recent changes? And it's really trying to up the ante and get Australian businesses and government to pay attention to the Privacy Act and use it as the driving force in how they manage people's information. Are you being asked to assess postures or look deeper into that channel?
Well, I guess I've been fortunate enough to work with organisations in a consulting capacity for more than 10 years. And I still remember back to when the notifiable data breach scheme got through Parliament, and I guess consultants in the room probably did a bit of a fist pump, hoping that was going to be the next lever that we could pull to really get the attention of clients so that we could help them. I think the reality is that we didn't really see that. We didn't really see the momentum pick up off the back of that I think we all thought was going to come as a professional. And so I guess we questioned, well, why was that the case as we were preparing? And I think that the reality for me is that organisations still don't necessarily feel the pain or understand the pain associated with not complying with the Act. We've got a number of colleagues that focus their attention in privacy, and they work very closely with complying with the APPs. But it's very much around business process and how they treat the data rather than how they secure the data. And obviously being business resilience, cyber security professionals, I guess that's where we spend most of our time. So
it sounds like in some cases they bring you in for a standard over here or a driver over here where perhaps there's greater consequences or very specific penalties or an inability to do business within your given industry, and that's their driver in the first place, and perhaps some of the outcomes from that overlap to somewhat in helping them with meeting the Privacy Act and whatnot. But at the same time, what you're telling me is that they're not fully putting the Privacy Act on the table and saying we need help with this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair summary of it. I guess where we do start a conversation much more actively is around something like PCI DSS, where the stakeholders can really, I guess, appreciate and understand the consequence, or RFFR, right? If you don't have that alignment, then the business is not coming your way. So I guess it's a little bit like speeding fines, right? If you drive through a speed camera, does it really change your action? But if you get pulled over by the cop at the side of the road, it really does help to cement the activity. So
that's a good analogy.
So I think that's why the notifiable data breach scheme didn't really drive that momentum of changing the cyber security space that we were expecting.
Lack of awareness in a way.
But you obviously work with organisations all over the world, and obviously everyone's probably familiar with GDPR. So what are you seeing? Are you seeing privacy requirements driving data security requirements internationally?
It's an interesting question. So again, I'll throw out to the audience just briefly, who here is somewhat familiar with GDPR? That's more than I expected. Who here knows CCPA? They're the consultants in the room. So, and the last acronym I just gave you is California's latest Privacy Act to protect its citizens' data. And just for more fun, they're changing that acronym to CPRA next year in 2023. They're going from the California Consumer Privacy Act to the California Consumer Privacy Rights Act. So, I think on an international level, firstly, let me say that it's a challenge. I think the revelation for a lot of organizations today, no matter where you are in the world, is that it's no longer necessarily about the regulations that exist in the country where you are domiciled. It's about the regulations that exist where your customers are domiciled. So if you're collecting data from customers in other countries, it's not just a case of complying with your own local laws. It's a case of understanding what their laws are and what you have to be ready for should there be an incident or if something goes wrong. And so, to take the US very briefly, that's a real challenge because there is no national legislation around privacy. At the moment, every single state is looking at implementing their own local legislation on how you as a business or organization have to protect the data of citizens of that state. And so at the moment, California's passed law, Colorado's passed law, there's New York law, and I think there's 11 or 12. Don't quote me on that, but we're definitely not at 50 states. And the belief is that in the next number of years, before all states eventually figure it out, the federal parliament will come out with its own law, and then we'll have to go comply with that. But that's just a mess on its own. The bigger one that we most commonly hear of is the GDPR. I like to think of it as kind of the gold standard in the world. It is probably the toughest regulation to try and comply with as far as personal information and making sure you're collecting it correctly, handling it correctly, and securing it correctly. The GDPR has this concept of adequacy. So when you're trying to measure the GDPR against other privacy laws around the world, only 11 other countries have been deemed as having adequate privacy laws against the GDPR, which makes cross-border transfer of personal information easier, because it just means if you comply with your local law, then you can move data around and it's okay. If you're not one of those 11 countries, and Australia is not one of those 11 countries, then you've got to go to some extra steps if you intend to bring information of Europeans into Australia and store it here. So, think of a worst case scenario. Maybe you're a data backup provider or some sort of cloud provider, and you have a European customer, and some of their data ends up on servers that you're running or responsible for here in Australia. You have additional things that you have to do as a result. Without diving into all the nuances and comparisons, there are some fundamental differences between why Australia's privacy law is where it is at the moment and what the GDPR requires you to do. Simple things like, on a non-security front, you've all seen the cookie pop-ups now. That's probably why a lot of you have heard and seen GDPR. Under GDPR, you must get someone's implied consent to collect their information. You can't just auto-tick I accept boxes on a form. You must get them to actually tick the box to say, yes, I agree to the terms and conditions. In Australia, it's the other way around at the moment. You can get away with implied consent and a few other things. On the other front, from an incident response standpoint, which, at AusCERT, it's always a topic of interest. If you suffer an incident that involves personal data, personal information, under the GDPR, you have to be able to respond in 72 hours and notify the regulator with as much information you can about what's happened, including an approximation of how many records you've lost and so on, and then start the incident response. In Australia, under the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, we're a little bit more easygoing at the moment. I believe it's 30 days is considered reasonable. And this is, there's a number of different reasons as to why GDPR looked at Australia's current version of the privacy law and went, well, we don't quite consider you adequate enough. So I think, Australian businesses, imagine if GDPR was introduced in Australia. I think organisations would have an uphill battle based on where they currently stand. Yeah,
and it's funny. Many of the conversations that start in my world with organisations around privacy as the driver for that start with GDPR. Or we do work with, or we want to work with data from Europe, and what does that mean for us? And that really then starts that conversation about improving the posture and really understanding what it means for them. And I think what it means for them becomes quite hair-raising when you talk about the penalties associated with GDPR. And I think you've worked with some clients in the past that have got the same shock, right?
Yeah. Look, obviously, I think there's two motives here. There's obviously driving businesses to do the right thing with people's individual data. But the other side of it is attacking big tech. Obviously, there's been a lot of bad press on big tech having too much control. I think the Cambridge Analytica incident years ago was a catalyst to really driving forth the privacy narrative across the world in particular. But Europe really used that as yet another example to say, this is why we need to put the privacy of citizens way up the top compared to where it's been in the past. I'm sure all of you in this room can remember a time where it was the Wild West. The more information you could collect about an individual, the better. Maybe you can figure out more insights, maybe we can do other forms of marketing to them, and that's completely flipped in this world of regulation. In fact, the UN came out and said now, I believe it's 134 countries have modern privacy regulation that they're either working on or have in place. This is a complete quantum shift from where we've ever been compared to in the past. And so on the fines and regulation front, that's obviously what drives organisations to do something. And I understand now that in the last number of years since GDPR enforcements have been applied, the penalties have exceeded over $1 billion from the regulator. Now, a lot of that is weighted heavily to big tech, but there are a number of smaller organisations that are being fined considerable amounts relative to their revenue and their size, because under GDPR you can be fined up to 4% of your global revenue, depending on how severe the breach is, or 10 million euros. I guess more locally, what we're seeing some proposed changes in the privacy regulation in terms of the penalties are going up, or at least there's a proposal to put the penalties up from a couple of $1 million to $10 million, and to do things like set a maximum of 10% of your Australian revenue. So there are some signals there where they want to make the teeth stronger in terms of getting people to pay more attention to the Privacy Act. But there are a number of other propositions coming down the line that, in my reading, really makes it sound like we could be heading towards a Privacy Act that reads a bit like the GDPR, which in real terms would mean that your average Australian organisation needs to become very aware of the personal data that they're holding, where it is, what types of personal data that you're holding, what's really sensitive versus what's normal types of personal data, and then if something bad were to happen, to make sure you're in a position to be able to respond very quickly and be able to get to each individual subject and tell them that you have had an incident that impacts them, and you can articulate what you believe that impact is. So there's definitely some interesting movements that we're seeing on that front, just on the Privacy Act.
But I think we're seeing some interesting movements across all of government policy, right? So we have the Australian data strategy, looking to help the economy grow based on maximising the value of data, right? So I think when I look at the Privacy Act, for me, it really resonates around making sure that we're doing the right thing with personal identifiable information. And I think, given its age, it wasn't really focused on the value of that information, and it's obviously been commoditized by criminals to a greater extent, and I guess it continues to be of interest to nation states as well. So we've seen a shift in the threat and the value of that data. Obviously, the second tenet of the data strategy is obviously around trust and protection, and I think that's been an underlying theme of privacy acts around the world. But
and let me bring up a slide actually on the National Data Security Action Plan, because I think that's this is a key change that we've certainly seen on other fronts, and it seems quite timely given that there's a review of the Privacy Act that's been going. It's actually been going on since 2019, and the government's collected a lot of feedback. But now the government's come out with the National Data Security Action Plan, and what's really interesting is that this is a discussion paper at this stage. It's not legislation. They're calling for feedback. They put it out at the end of last year, and we all have until next month. June 10, I think.
June 10, yeah, absolutely.
June 10, to provide feedback on some of the thoughts and ideas and approaches that are being talked about in this discussion paper, and we put the URL up there for you all, or you can just Google it, National Data Security Action Plan. But I think this is a new approach to thinking about a problem that hasn't really been addressed on a national level. That's certainly one of the things I picked up on it. What did you think about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think this goes to that final tenet of the data strategy, which is obviously enabling data use, right? So we know that organisations are collecting more and more data, whether it be personal identifiable information, but just data in general, right? We, as the knowledge economy continues to grow, data is going to become incredibly valuable to all Australian organisations. And I think it's interesting that the Home Affairs Department has really put this paper out there for some discussion. When I read it, it's quite interesting that they seem, in my opinion, to focus much more on the confidentiality of the data, and obviously that goes back to the idea of value, making sure that that we understand that data is kept secure, that the use of it is accountable, that the use of it is is controlled.
Yeah, and again, this is not a standard or a regulation, this is a discussion paper, but the themes that I saw coming out of it weren't all about cybersecurity. It wasn't all about confidentiality, integrity, availability. No. It was about data security. It was about really focusing on how are we securing the underlying data down to almost the record level. You know, it would be my interpretation. I think when we think about security, particularly in cyber and whatnot, we're thinking about securing applications, networks, infrastructure, and then when it comes to data, we're thinking about maybe securing data repositories as a whole, but without necessarily understanding anything beneath that. And really what some of the themes are that we're seeing in this paper is very much around not just concepts that you would expect to see in more mature organizations, but across most types of organizations in saying, well, how would your average business in Australia truly understand all the data that is collected about individuals? But I think the paper also goes a little bit further beyond personal as well to say other data that you have is highly valuable, like IP, because, you know, again, you mentioned nation states before. The sovereignty of our IP is a huge problem. The government certainly wants to encourage, motivate, and help wherever possible organisations to help lock down and protect and understand, you know, valuable data. And I think that's, again, one of the other themes. But I found in particular very interesting a very strong tone around how you're protecting data generally, a zero in on personal data, and definitely some connection with the Privacy Act. But I don't necessarily think one of the outputs from this process will be that this replaces the Privacy Act. Maybe there might be some influence into what happens to the Privacy Act. But what we could very well see is some guidance or even some framework around helping businesses understand how to secure data in a more broader sense, and not just businesses, government as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I guess part of the discussion calls for how governments can sort of further help and support businesses to understand the value of their data and uplift that data security posture. And I think that's the natural progression, right? So we started talking about the Privacy Act, and we obviously talked about GDPR, and I think that the GDPR discussion is very much around the cost of non-compliance. But I think that the opportunity here with this plan, with the discussion paper, is really to start to help all organisations, whether they be small or multinational, really hone in on the value of data, right?
Yeah, actually, so I just grabbed one piece of paper from this discussion paper. It's page 27. It's basically the final call for views on what they want feedback on. They've asked some very specific questions, 15 all in all. And again, we're not here to deep dive on heavy topics, but there's a couple of questions that both of us kind of looked at and thought, let's quickly have a chat about just a few specific things that we think are relevant. And one of those questions was, how can the Australian government further support your business to understand the value of data and uplift your data security posture? What are your initial thoughts on that question, Chris?
I think that we've got a fantastic opportunity for our government to really help us understand what is happening across our whole economy, right? I think government's in an enviable position to be able to see what's happening in so many different organisations. If for nothing else, being able to judge the value of an organisation and then really help those business owners to connect the value of their organisation back to the data that they rely upon. We all pay tax. Organisations, they pay their tax based on obviously on profit. So being able to share with them use cases around how much data attributes to the value of that organisation, and show that across different industry sectors, because I think the value of data to businesses is clearly very different in many different sectors, and government can help us to understand and join those dots together.
And how security can then help, in terms of maintaining the value of that data and not losing that data. I think there's a saying out there, some of you guys have seen it, I'm sure, data is the new oil. And it's commonly understood now and in fact accepted that businesses and organisations, governments have never had such valuable data. In fact, it's probably in many cases the most valuable asset that they're sitting on, and yet many organisations don't fully understand all of those assets that they hold. And so I think, whatever comes out of this action plan, I think what we can hope is that it'll bring focus back to setting some standardised approaches on what businesses can do to secure data rather than secure infrastructure. Get out of that firewall mentality. Get out of that building the strongest, tallest walls around your organisation, around your network as a strategy to protect whatever is inside it. But if by chance someone found their way inside, then it's open slather and they can see everything and access a lot of things that they probably shouldn't be able to. So moving away from that mentality, in organisations that perhaps don't have as a mature IT capability as larger organisations, although both of us have seen larger organisations that suffer from the same problem. You mentioned tax, so you reminded me of the tax office. Think about the ATO. Right now, the ATO is a heavily dependent on department because they're effectively responsible for revenue collection of the country. So therefore, they go to a lot of effort to teach and train and maintain knowledge across both the financial community in business and also in the professional community who are advising businesses and individuals on how to comply with tax laws. And it almost seems like one of the areas that government could really focus on is how to better educate and how to better support the IT professional community and perhaps even the security consulting community in having a standardized way of how to help organizations. Because at the moment, depending on which standard you're complying with, there's consistency within a standard, but there is not consistency across all the different standards and all the different regulations because they have different motives, different goals, different aims. We mentioned PCI before. That really only cares about the card number, the credit card number. It doesn't have any care about any other forms of personal information. So the fact that we're talking about a national plan that again focuses on a variety of different data types is, I think, a good thing, but certainly it'll need to be underpinned by education and a lot more awareness than say the Privacy Act has right now.
Yeah, look, I think the ATO has a bunch of rules, but I think if you look at it from a principles point of view, then it's much easier to apply it across many different organisations. Right? Today, it's very difficult for an organisation to really decide, okay, should I follow IRAP, should I follow 27001 is Essential 8 for me, right? There's a lot of different options, and I think if government's able to help us to set out some key principles about what does it take to achieve data security and show organisations what good looks like, then we can take away a lot of the guessing work that many of our clients sort of start with.
Who knows, maybe there's even a role for organisations like AusCERT and other non-profit security-focused organisations to play a part in that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that government can do is really start to help organisations understand the threat and to be able to identify the impact of that threat upon them much quicker, right? We all wake up, we check the weather, we get an update on the weather report at the end of the day, and it's real-time information, and we can make a call based on what we're seeing.
Storytelling. Yeah, teaching people through storytelling. Just actually a quick example you reminded me of was when I did my SANS GPEN many moons ago, my instructor who flew from the US out here to Australia, while in between sessions, he was showing us some of the live incident response data that they were getting because he was on the SANS incident response team, and he was showing us a collector node that had been discovered inside the university, and he was just showing us samples of what that collector node was getting from all of these obviously malware instances that have been deployed, and it was showing us very, very specific dossiers of individuals where they had managed to collect someone's name, their bank credentials, their email credentials, their Facebook and MySpace page, because it was a little while ago now, and a variety of other very specific things, including some deeply personal habits that person had based on the sort of websites that they were going to. And I had never seen such a concise dossier of an individual, and I am absolutely sure that this person had no idea that this had been collected. And again, you see things like that firsthand, but it completely changes your mindset in motivating you to want to do something about it. And it's almost like we need the same approach at government level. How are we constantly educating businesses on the real life things that are happening, but in a much more real-time way? Yeah,
well, it comes back to the example of the police officer and the speeding fine, right?
Yeah.
I think there's probably research out there that shows that when you get stopped, you change your action a lot quicker.
There was one other question I wanted to jump to, if that's okay, Chris. So again, in the call for views, there's a question about what steps can your business take to understand the value of the data they process or store, and do businesses have sufficient awareness of their data security obligations? I think, this really hits home for me and lays back onto a lot of what we talked about. But what's your thought on this particular question that they've put out there?
Yeah, I think businesses really have started to appreciate that cybersecurity, cyber resilience is an important aspect of being in business today. But I still feel that joining the dots between the value of what you've got, the dependencies that you have on your data, and the ability to run your company, and the impacts of that are still unknown for many organizations. And when I say that, right, we have a very broad economy, and many of our colleagues here today work for those larger organizations that have a security team, but we also work with organizations that really don't have that access to a full security team. Yeah. And so the start of many of those conversations is, well, what does this mean to me? Why would I care? If I had $1 for every time I hear the phrase, well, hackers aren't interested in me, I've got nothing worth stealing, I'd probably be able to retire. Yeah. I think that there's still a long way to go in terms of helping people understand why cyber is important to their business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that layers into a little stat that we've collected in recent times, which is that Ground Labs does a lot of different things out there, running webinars, pulling groups of people together, and we very often ask the simple question to try and keep it as specific as possible, which is, do you believe your organization knows where it's storing all of its data? And so around 70% of those respondents will say no, we really don't think our organization knows where all of its data is. And I think that just brings back to what one of the key elements of this plan is trying to bring to the surface. Because prior to this, there wasn't really a strong narrative, certainly in Australia, that was telling every business, do you really understand all the data that you have, putting aside any specific regulations? And certainly our evidence says that even today, in the year 2022, there are so many organizations that up until now, even mature security programs and privacy programs have often taken a manual approach to trying to figure out where information is ending up across the business. And it's a fairly straightforward data mapping process. Go talk to each head of department or each major stakeholder across the organization and say, hey, Chris, so you run customer service. Can you tell me what personal information you guys are collecting and how you're collecting it and what fields you're collecting, and just show me your business workflow, and does it get stored anywhere else apart from this CRM system? And so, you'll get a bunch of answers. Mm-hmm. They probably sound like pretty good answers, and you'll do that across every other part of the organization and effectively draw up a plan on saying, right, well, now we know where all the risk areas are. Let's now go put in some controls to address those risks and bring the risks down. And unfortunately, and very often, data breaches will still happen to organizations that have undergone that kind of process. And very often it's the data that they were not aware of that was the data that was so easily stolen when unfortunately the time came and someone did find a way into their business or their network. Similar experience from what you've seen out in the field.
Yeah, look, and it's a complex problem, right? You described the manual process there of looking, go talk to people, map it out, draw it out, and often then that's kind of where it stops. I did an exercise with a colleague a few years ago where we tried to map out, okay, what information is of value to us individually, personally, and where is it, right?
Yeah.
And it's a mind-boggling exercise, right? You have all the obvious ones, right? You have your email, and you use your email for your banking, and so there's a connection there. But then, okay, you got 3 hard drives in the back of the cupboard that's got family photos on, and what do you do?
10 USB sticks in your drawer.
10 USB sticks, and those things turn up in the weirdest of places, don't they?
Car parks, I hear.
Yeah. So I think that it has to start with the manual, manual approach. But I think we also need a more systematic approach to evolve and clarify and check what we understand.
Sort of layers onto the whole discussion that many of you have heard about, which is how do we make security a BAU process? How do we build it into every business process? So it's not an exception-based approach. It's not when we go look, then we uncover. It's something that automatically happens all the time inside the business, in every process, in every new platform application, acquisition even. And when things are not the way they are supposed to be, there are proactive alerts generated as opposed to finding it out during the next assessment or the next audit. Yeah, it's and again, we could probably talk for hours on this in terms of the examples we've both seen. I've certainly, and you have too, have had organisations that have said, those systems, we are not storing anything. Okay, we've already looked, we're good, we're clean. And as an assessor, I think the saying is, trust but verify.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I think it just in recognition of time that we've got today, I think we could carry on for many hours. But I think what I want to leave the audience with is the fact that the action plan is coming and that we have an opportunity to try and influence government in how we secure data more generally than just privacy information. And I think that we need to start the journey to understand what data we have within our organizations and lead that conversation into, well, what's the value of that data, and help them understand if we get this wrong, if the business doesn't secure it, well, what's the implications for them?
And I think that's probably one of the summarised points here is, irrespective of what does end up happening out in the legislative landscape out there, irrespective of where the Privacy Act ends up, irrespective of what comes out of this National Data Security Action Plan, it's definitely a strong signal that says that businesses are being asked to start to think more about the data rather than the cybersecurity aspect and the repositories, and really start to understand the individual records. Should you be holding them? Where are they? What have you collected? Can you delete it? One of the best strategies is data minimization, and you can't begin that process until you've actually understood where it all is. So just being very brief on this particular topic, we mentioned a manual approach before. That's been the traditional way, but there are other ways, and one of them is a systematic approach using data discovery. If you're interested in understanding more about how that would work and how it could get into cloud, into on-prem, desktops, email, you name it, and start to help an organisation understand where data has ended up, you can go chat to my colleagues out on the floor at the Ground Lab stand. It's the dark navy blue stand towards the back, and we can certainly let you know more about it. And if you do work with any of these fine organisations up here in a security consulting assistance manner, including Securo, including Vectra Corp, including CyberCX, there's colleagues and friends of ours from all these great organisations, and some of the others as well walking around AusCERT as they always do, then you can also talk to them about Ground Labs. They all have excellent knowledge in our product. They've been using our products for typically 10 years in Australia. So with that said, I won't speak any more other than to say, look, I hope this was helpful. Thanks, Chris, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve and Chris. Quite an interesting discussion. There have been a few questions, but they all centre around basically the question I was kind of asking, is how close will any of these upcoming changes to the Australian Privacy Act or the privacy principles or any other aspects regulated and governed by the OIC, will that bring us to GDPR? And realistically, is there one of these standards, GDPR for example, that we should target that will actually give us coverage across the board, especially for an international organisation, or do we still need to synthesise our own common set of baseline requirements that are actually above every single one?
I think every country wants its own sovereignty, right? So there's no way Australia's just going to say, yep, GDPR, whack a Aussie government logo on it, and off we go. Look, my reading of the feedback and the questions that have come up during the consultative process on the Privacy Act review definitely is pointing towards how do we align Australia privacy with GDPR. Australia can still have its own privacy regs and laws and ways of doing it, but the key thing is to make sure that when we get into the notification, when we get into the definition of personal data, when we get into the, for example, in GDPR, you must appoint a data protection officer in the organisation. Under Australian privacy, you do not have to do that. So just things like that is where we may see more alignment. And they're good things, but at the same time, organisations are struggling to comply with GDPR. I mean, it came out in May 2018. I don't know what the latest stat is, but it's low in terms of compliance. And even the UK, after Brexit, you know, they've been looking at how can they maybe water down their alignment to GDPR just a little bit while staying adequate. So there's a few interesting things that are being thought about there just to make it more achievable for average business. When you're a large organisation with budget, resources, time, you can obviously fully comply, but an average organisation really is struggling. And you know, I think there's got to be a happy medium, but the reading of what I'm seeing is that it does seem like Australia would like to try and get aligned and possibly become adequate against the GDPR, but it's not explicit, at least from what I've read, and I could be wrong here, I haven't seen it explicitly stated that, you know, that is the goal of this review process. But it is interesting that this review process started in 2019, 12, 18 months after GDPR came out, and they've just wrapped up the feedback process. So from here, we'll wait to see the cogs turn in the background and what starts coming out on the front line.
Great. Thank you all again. We now have lunch, and then at 1:15 we'll resume the broken out the split room sessions.
Oh, lovely.
Oh, thanks, Vlad.